Joining me up here will be first Dr. Ursula Fuentes-Hutfelter. Ursula has been working at the interface of science and climate and energy policy for more than 20 years. She is a senior climate policy advisor with Climate Analytics, based in Perth, where she's leading projects focusing on energy transition in the Asia Pacific. She's also an adjunct associate professor at Murdoch University, where she leads a project under the Australian-German Energy Transition Research Hub, focusing on opportunities for Southeast Asia to transition to renewable energy, as well as developing the Western Australian hub node. Before coming to WA, Ursula worked for the German Federal Environment Ministry as head of unit, where she was responsible for the development of climate plans and programs, including the Climate Action Plan 2050, the German long-term strategy delivered to the UNFCCC in 2016. Anya Nova is our second panellist. Anya is a crypto economist at Power Ledger, which is one of Australia's most exciting blockchain companies. In 2017, Power Ledger completed Australia's first initial coin offering, raising $34 million. In 2018, Power Ledger won the Extreme Tech Challenge, a global competition of the most innovative global companies run on Sir Richard Branson's island. As a crypto economist, Anya has an exciting job at the intersection of blockchain technology, financial markets, business models, and game theory. Much of Anya's time is spent coming up with new ideas and incentive structures and pioneering new blockchain-based software products. Most recently, Anya developed a renewable energy investment product that is run on blockchain and that will become Australia's first regulated energy offering utilising a security token. Gary Bryant is our last panellist this evening. Gary is a professional engineer with over 25 years' experience in utility scale generation industry. He's a chartered professional engineer and is an elected member of the WA Division Committee of the Institute of Engineers and a member of the Western Australian Mining Industry Advisory Committee. Gary is currently the General Manager Asset Strategy at Alinta, where he is responsible for power development across Australia. His key projects today at Alinta include the Newman to Roy Hill transmission line, the Port Hedland repowering project, the Newman 35 megawatt battery energy storage system project, the Yandon wind farm, and the Chichester solar gas hybrid project in the Pilbara. If the panellists could please come and join me up the front. Governments in Australia and overseas have provided economic stimulus to encourage the development of renewable technologies. For instance, I understand that recently the German government has agreed on a 2-year, $130 billion economic stimulus recovery package from coronavirus, which contains a number of measures to boost the country's energy transition. This has aided development of technology and transition of generation on our grids around the world. However, when launching WA's energy transition roadmap in 2019, Minister Johnston reinforced the role of thermal power in the Swiss. Do you think Australia, and Western Australia in particular, is moving fast enough to ensure climate change stays below a peak temperature of 1.5 degrees? And how does Australia compare to other developed or developing nations?
Thank you. Well, yes, that's, I guess, a couple of questions. Maybe starting with the question, is Australia doing enough, and is the world doing enough to achieve the Paris Agreement goal? You refer to the 1.5 limit. That's exactly, that is the temperature limit that was agreed with the Paris Agreement. So all countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, this is now almost exactly 5 years ago, in a couple of months, 5 years ago, have agreed to this temperature goal of keeping global warming compared to pre-industrial levels well below 2 degrees and doing everything.
This microphone isn't working very well, apparently.
Yeah, is this better? And pursuing efforts to stay below the 1.5 limit. And this is quite important because this really defines what countries should be doing. And already in the, before Paris, countries had contributed their national targets, their national contributions. So for example, Australia, the 26 to 28% reduction compared to 2005. But already in Paris, the international community knew that all these contributions were not enough, not even enough to achieve what used to be the old objective of staying below a 2-degree limit. So in Paris, that limit was made more ambitious in order to reduce the risks of climate change. And already then, the community knew what was on the table, what countries had provided as targets was not enough. And that's why the Paris Agreement also includes a ratcheting up mechanism. So countries are supposed to look into their targets every 5 years and see how they can enhance their ambition so that we globally can stay below this temperature limit. And this is a very important limit because there is a real difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And with Paris, there was also an agreement to ask the scientific community, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to provide the science behind what the difference is between 1.5 and 2, and also what is necessary to achieve this. So this is what should be guiding countries. And it is clear that the Australian target is not consistent with achieving such a limit. But what is also clear is that because we have such a fantastic progress in terms of technologies in the renewable energy space and also storage and grid development, that more is possible. And what countries thought was achievable under certain economic circumstances 5 years ago was done in a different world. So more is possible now with technological progress. And that's why it's possible to enhance targets. So that can be done at national level, and we have also done studies as Climate Analytics how Australia can enhance the target, and Western Australia, of course, is an important state within Australia and with important opportunities for renewable energies, can do the same. So, so the overall targets have to be enhanced, and that also means accelerating the transition to renewable energy, because that transition in the power sector is one of the core elements, moving away from fossil fuels, phasing out coal by 2030 in OECD countries, and accelerating a transition to renewable energy with the power sector helping decarbonizing other sectors through electrification. So electric mobility, heat pumps instead of heating with gas. So this is a double role that this decarbonization of the electricity sector has, and that means accelerating the uptake of renewable energy.
Thanks. So Anya, sticking on that theme of accelerating the uptake of renewable energy and the transition to renewable energy generally, as we all know, rooftop solar PV in Western Australia has had a huge uptake, with installed capacity being at about 1,100 megawatts, which is 3 times larger than our single largest generator in the Swiss. By 2029, this is expected to grow to about 2,500 megawatts. Because of this, interestingly, the Swiss had its lowest trading interval on record this January, which having the lowest trading interval in January back in the old days would have been unheard of. The duck curve caused by this solar power causes real issues for AEMO as the system operator. What technologies might be able to assist us with this excess generation that we have in the Swiss because of the renewable technologies?
It's an excellent question, so thanks for that. We did see quite incredible growth in distributed renewables, as you said, rooftop solar PV and household batteries. And I think while it's super exciting and heartening to see people making that choice, it's also creating a massive problem for the grid operators, and it's not just happening in Australia. So I recently spoke to the head of California ISO, also having a few conversations with European ISOs, and they're all in the same situation where they obviously have a situation where there's lots of solar during the day, as you described, and then the demand is mostly in the evening. So there is a strain being put on the grid. The operators are trying to deal with it, and they're either curtailing renewables, which creates a really interesting situation where first we had a feed-in tariff, which is incentivizing us to install renewables, And now governments around the world trying to come up with a kind of tariff that's going to incentivize us not to use the renewables that we have installed using the first tariff. So that really reminds me, my background is, I'm originally from Russia, and that reminds me of the Soviet kind of command-style central economy where governments are trying to have the right economic outcomes, but often they're using information and data that could be months old or a year old, and they're only able to basically work with large entities as well. They're not able to use the kind of the knowledge and the wisdom and the economic incentives of the crowd. So there's all these interesting things going on. I think the grid has really changed, where you can't just replace the centralized system where you have the power plant in the middle and all the energy was flowing to the periphery, and then all financial flows and information flows were flowing to the center. You have a completely different system where you have multiple nodes, so people are acting both as a consumer and as a prosumer, so then the information and the financial flows have to go and flow both ways. So you have to have a market with real-time pricing data, you're going to have better outcomes. And of course, the right kind of technology to enable that would be something like every market participant in the system gets a digital ID, and whether that's a large power plant or like your toaster, doesn't matter. On top of that digital ID, you have to have a marketplace, and that's where blockchain really comes into that, because blockchain is a market technology that ensures there is an accurate audit trail for all the microtransactions. And then on top of that, you have same-day payments. So we've actually done a trial to see if that works in real time. We've established a localized energy market in Fremantle, which probably some of you know about, and there was 48 households trading with each other. And what we found is that the price signal that's being created, because people are able to set the maximum buy price for the energy from their neighbor or someone in their community, and their minimum sell price, what that does is that it in effect creates an incentive for households to buy batteries in the places where they are needed most. So batteries can be used for energy arbitrage, so buy low, sell high, or they can start getting utilized for things like frequency control services and network congestion, which if you start allowing people to participate in those markets, they can pay off their battery really quickly. And that's just talking about like the household batteries. And if you have an electric vehicle, that's a completely new story, because an electric vehicle can actually travel to the areas of the network that need support the most. So yeah, I think a real-time marketplace with agile pricing is something that's going to enable an orderly integration of distributed renewables into the grid without straining the grid operators.
Thanks for that. Gary, sticking on distributed renewables, the state government's DER roadmap was released earlier this year. Do you think that goes far enough to support our energy transition and our grid issues? Or do you think it might be overly ambitious given the state's slow rate of change? And really, how do you think the grid will look, or the Swiss reform will look, over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think most utilities have been grappling with this for a couple of years, and there's many facets to this, so I'll give you my perspective, I guess. I think we should first acknowledge really the excellent work that's being done by the West Australian Government. We're pretty fast to give people a hard time about things we think they're falling short on, but I think that in this particular example, the West Australian Government has, through its Energy Policy Institute, and the Minister, really been taking an appropriately cautious approach to grid stability. It's no news to anyone what's gone on in New South Wales and Queensland with ancillary services and the rapid explosion of renewables. As developers, they're hurting at the moment because of connection issues, testing issues. The ancillary services market, I think last quarter, the payments in the ancillary services market alone were greater in one quarter than the previous 2 years, which shows that there's a real weakness in the network that really would erode the value that the renewables might bring. So I think what the West Australian Government here is they have all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle on the table, and we could sort of argue for years about whether we think they're acting on them fast enough or in the right order, but they are acting on them. And I think you mentioned one there around the demand side, where they're trying to figure out a way to curtail solar in the middle of the day, move it to the edges of later in the day or earlier in the day by the alignment of the panels, And I think those incentive mechanisms are excellent. But I think the constrained access model that currently exists on the network over here, which means as a generator, when you're connected historically, you were guaranteed all of your power being able to be exported to the grid, which meant that subsequent generators that connected, if you were going to impair that person or that company's ability to export power, you weren't allowed to be connected, which led to a massive underutilisation of the transmission infrastructure. They went through a competing access group program where 2 years ago they gave 9 new connections out. They would be the only connections offered until that constrained access regulations had passed through Parliament, which is going on now and forms part of that roadmap. I think that's one of the first really big issues that needed to be addressed to encourage more connections. Solving for the AEMO systems, like the Western Power system was the original dispatch system. It had its limitations. The Swiss is not a big market in terms of the amount of electricity generation. There's not that many customers and there weren't that many power stations. And so the system that they had was fit for purpose. Was it fit for the new world with more renewables and the enormous rooftop solar and distributed generation? I think most of us would think that it wasn't, and it needed some substantial upgrade. And that work is ongoing. And I think the third piece that we really need to be conscious of is energy policy and the minister's attempts to proactively form a market for what they call the essential system services. And the dinosaur engineers in the room will understand that's the ancillary services market on the East Coast. And without that ancillary services market, renewables are dead in the water. The one truth is that no one wants the hospital intensive care unit's power to go out because of a voltage spike or a frequency issue. And so maintaining that system security is a very challenging job, and I really feel for the guys who run the networks in that regard. So I think those are the two things that I think you really need, or three things that I think the government should be given credit for before I start on about the things which they probably could do a little bit better for, ironically. So I think one of the things that we really don't have a good handle on as users, and some people in the industry probably do have a good handle on it, is what Anya mentioned before. Historically, power flows centre to fringe and information flows fringe back to centre. When you start having this distributed generation, the way that we monitor power, and especially faults, it moves from the centralised generation asset, and we spend a lot of money on protection schemes and detection and fault clearing so that everyone's safe. So when a high voltage power line hits the ground, it does trip out, and it's generally safe to operate. But if you've got houses that are generating power that's flowing back into the system, into those high voltage networks, they don't have the same protection systems looking further out. And the amount of investment that'll be required for that sort of distributed generation to participate on a grid in the same safe way that the centralised utilities do is a real challenge of our time. And the Electric Networks Association has been sort of lobbying and talking about how do you get to that point, and the sorts of money they're talking about that you need to invest to get the grid to that level of security and safety are quite frankly staggering. And that's a big challenge for how we move the grid to a position where it can actually accept this power flow coming from the fringe to the centre, but then information and data flowing the other way, so that we all know that the grid will be kept safe and secure.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
That does, that's fantastic. Do you think there's anything else the WA government could be doing to assist the transition, given the renewable energy boom we're seeing over east? Or
for sure.
covered all?
That back on my other 2 points. I might have been asked this question earlier. So I think from a Lindsay's perspective, we absolutely need more retail competition to encourage private enterprises to invest in the renewable energy future. It's a straight commercial decision that without access to the load to sell the power, private organisations don't have the investment signals that are required to have that large-scale investment in renewable in order to drive those overall costs down and to put the thermal generation under pressure. So I think there are steps being made towards that in some markets in Western Australia, and I point to the lowering of retail thresholds in the NWIS, so which is the Northwest Interconnected System, of which Alinta is one of the competitors to the incumbent government state-owned corporation up there. But down here, I think if you had more retail competition, and we're not saying full retail competition, but just a little bit more access to load, I think you'd find that organisations like Alinta and our competitor organisations would certainly be looking to develop a lot more renewables in this state, and that includes the storage and the ancillary services or essential services component. I think the other thing which is important, and it was touched on before, is we're all aware of the proposed stage closure of the Muja power station. It's a highly inefficient coal-fired power station, and there's I guess, you know, you hear stories that if coal-fired power stations close, then the whole network falls over. I think we closed the Flinders power station in South Australia when Alinta had that power station. There were problems that weren't related to the closure of that power station that caused the mass blackout in South Australia. And I think it was more to do with not really understanding the essential services that power station provided. And I think the difference here in Western Australia is the government's taken a very proactive approach about ensuring that those ancillary services, inertia, voltage control, load following, they're all dealt with before that happens. But that being said, if you close that particular facility faster, then the demand-supply balance and the price signals would encourage investment. I think Anya pointed it out before that, oh no, it might have been you, this facility, is the duct bill and the price signals that come through from that are quite unacceptably high risks to a private investor. And so we need a sort of a constant price signal, not a volatile price signal. And right now, you're in that world where there is that volatility, and we have to price that risk in, and it means we're not really at that point to make the decision. But once the demand-supply balance evens out and we get more stable pricing, then the price signals are there and the investments will absolutely follow.
And so I think we've seen in the last 12 months, United Kingdom has gone coal-free. Do you think there's any learnings we can take? Yes, they've gone coal-free but not nuclear-free and not gas turbine-free, and they've got good interconnectors into France, okay. where they have, you know, you go to Denmark and they can go to 100% renewable because it's always blowing wind there. It's predictable. It's not as intermittent as it is in Australia. So it's a little bit, you know, I would say cheeky for those claims to be made. They're definitely heading in the right path, I think, and they've got a very big chunk of money that they're looking at for hydrogen. And their hydrogen council has touched on a few things around heat pumps and the importance of heat pumps for cooling and heating. And they see a role of hydrogen in mobility to offset the increased cost of some of the gas then transitioning to renewables. But there's definitely some learnings there, which is I don't think we should put all of our eggs in one basket just yet. There's a supply mix. What does that look like? And you put 5 engineers in a room and you'll get 100 opinions. But there's definitely, I think, benefit in having a look at a number of different ways of storing the energy that's generated from the renewables. Did you have something to say on that, Ursula?
Yes. As you asked, what can we learn from the UK and what are the specific challenges? And you've highlighted a few of those and how to deal with them. I think an important element, and of course I get the point, there's a difference here in Western Australia and the Swiss. I guess it's the most isolated grid of the world. You don't have, and it's a relatively small market. So this is all very specific, and it's actually quite fascinating to see how such a system can transform. And not everything is the same. Of course, in Europe you have much more interconnection, and that provides a source of flexibility. On the other hand, I think there's hardly any place on this planet that has such fantastic resources for solar and wind as Western Australia. I mean, Australia as a whole, but in particular Western Australia. That I find, I mean, it's a wonderful place. You hear from my accent that I'm not from here, but I've been living here for a few years, and it's a fantastic place in many ways. But in specifically, this is really fascinating, these resources that exist, and we're seeing how this is attracting investors. even though the share of renewable energy is still low compared to these resources and compared to other countries. But there's a lot of happening, and it's not just those resources; it's also the skills level, and all these ingredients that are there. What is one of the differences is the UK has developed pathways and targets to move to net zero emissions quite early, and they have also reduction budgets in 5 years, looking into all sectors, having independent scientific advising on how these have to be developed. They even got through this with their Brexit mess because they had a certain infrastructure established, a political infrastructure. So, and we're seeing this in many other countries, and we're seeing that also in states here, like for example in Victoria. And I think that is one important ingredient, to have a strategy that goes across the economy and looking into how do we achieve. And it's fantastic, Western Australia has adopted a net zero emissions target recently. But how to achieve that and which sectors contribute how fast. And developing this and developing stepwise targets. That is something that UK has started early. And I think that helps an economy to develop clear targets, clear milestones, and then looking at what are the challenges. And another lesson we can learn not only from the UK, but also other countries that are increasingly looking into this across the sectors approach and looking into the role that the power sector has, as I mentioned, to decarbonize other sectors, because electrification of everything is a key strategy towards getting to net zero emissions and getting there fast enough to achieve the Paris Agreement limit. And that, of course, means more demand, more electricity demand. It would increase quite considerably already by 2030. But it also means that this coupling of the sectors provides new opportunities for that grid stability that is so important, in particular for such an isolated system. So achieving 100% renewable energy and electrifying other sectors, either directly or indirectly, producing fuels based on hydrogen from renewable electricity, can then in turn also help integrating more variable renewable energy in the system. So these are opportunities that, in particular, hydrogen is an opportunity that countries in Europe are only also recently looking at. But I think many in the whole world are looking into a place like this because of the huge opportunities here, actually to not only decarbonize very fast here, but even to export it to other countries and producing more. And we have some fantastic, fascinating projects developing in here, like in the Pilbara or in Kalbarri, focusing on export. So these pathways can be supported if you have an across-the-economy strategy supported by the government with targets to then look into the challenges but also the opportunities.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to decarbonisation at the end, but Anja, Ursula touched on skills and that WA is an attractive place to develop energy technology and to make the transition to renewable energy. What skills do you think we need in Western Australia? Which further skills do you think we need to facilitate the transition?
Well, I think it's the technology skills first and foremost, and maybe I can ask for a show of hands, how many people in the audience have rented out their apartment or their house on Airbnb? Just a few, so I have. So I use all this kind of apps all the time. But basically, when you're on Airbnb, you get notifications that say, if you increase your price for your apartment right now, you're still going to rent it out. And that's because Airbnb is scanning the entire market and knows what the price signal is. So imagine being like a battery owner or an electric vehicle owner and get notified in real time, oh, the energy prices are really high at the moment. You could sell the energy that's stored in your car battery and make that much money. Or the other way around, well, there's too much energy on the grid, why don't you suck some up? And we're going to pay you for that. So that's sort of technology that goes to every individual and that is super easy to use, that we're all kind of used to, that's on your phone, that would be super essential. And then, on the side of the grid operators, for example, I'm not sure how many people here have ever tendered for a service on Airtasker. Yeah, okay, more hands.
Oh, yeah.
So I do that all the time again. So grid operators should actually have a service that's like that, right? Where instead of tendering using an email address or like a procurement team, they can actually put their requirements and have a list of all the available service providers or households with batteries or solar or whatever that is, have the price that they're willing to accept for that kind of service, whether it's frequency control, something else, have their rating, what is the behavior of that person, do they typically drive at this period of time, what is the charge of the battery, what are their needs, and sort of how much does the network operator need that service at this point in time, and be able to actually tender for things in very much real time, getting the best outcome from an economic point of view. So all these things are not possible without developers, without UX designers. So we have quite a few web designers in Perth, but we don't really have a lot of kind of customer or facing businesses in Perth. So we're really short on some key skill sets there. We also need blockchain engineers. Basically, everything that you would want to have to build an economy that's based on technology, we probably need to find ways of attracting into WA.
Thank you. Gary, Alent is developing the Yandon wind farm, which will comprise 51 wind turbines and more than 4 megawatts of capacity. What do you think is holding back similar investments by other market participants? Do you think it's this technology issue that Anya touched on? You spoke about constrained access before. Do we need true constrained access before these projects can get off the ground? Do we need to augment our transmission and distribution systems to give them more capacity, which seems unlikely given the move to DER?
So I guess in addition to having access to the market, which I guess is probably the first point around some level of retail contestability, whatever that might look like, I'm quite optimistic that the constraint issues which have prevented quite a lot of utility scale connections from a power generation perspective hooking into the network will be resolved, along with the ancillary services or the essential services market opportunities. So the stability of the network will be resolved. I think then if you have those things, the planning environment in Western Australia for wind farms is not easy compared to the other states, I would say. Developing a wind farm is hard. In Western Australia it is a little bit harder. There are certain parts of the regulations which make it more difficult, and you don't necessarily have the same single point of contact for your development that you might have on the most of the eastern states. Over here it's a bit, it's the developer, as a developer, you have to go and find all these things and deal with them individually. So I think there's certainly some assistance that could be provided in the way that you get your permits and approvals, which would encourage development. And I say that because any organisation looking to invest in Australia, for the same kind of return, because the pool prices and the sort of returns you're going to get from a wind farm in Western Australia are going to be there or thereabouts to a wind farm in New South Wales, the risk to your investment and all that upfront expenditure to get the project to that point, which is, can be $10 to $20 million for projects such as Yandon. The owners are just going to want to direct those funds to the investment that has lower risk. It's a pretty straightforward decision on their part. So I think if you can make that process a little bit easier, then I think that would encourage further investment. Then I think the last thing is, and we see this on the East Coast, and it's really quite. I feel for the developers who do it. They build their power stations in parts of the network where it's easier to get the permits. The network access is a bit easier in a distribution system, but then they're now being hammered for marginal loss factors and the like. And some of the solar farms on the East Coast had increases of their marginal loss factors of 20%. So if you then one day a government agency just says 20% of your revenue is now gone, that's not 20% of your money, because you pay your debt back. That equity is underwater at that point in time. And so a little bit more assistance from the network planning side from Western Power about where do we need to build these things, where are you going to find it easier to connect and have less problems. I think a bit more visibility into that would certainly help with certainly organisations like Alinta making those decisions about where we want to invest and how big that investment could be. I think the last thing, which is a little nuance of the Swiss, mostly because I think it is small, is the amount of spinning reserve that has to be covered. It's not a big number in terms of how much has to be covered, but it does have big impacts on the generators that are on the network. So if you have a look at a single transmission element, you might have 2 power stations or 3 power stations on that one transmission element. And what they'll say is the spinning reserve we can carry might be 300 or 400 megawatts. Then the energy policy and the PUO have to say, well, we either carry more spinning reserve and that's a market cost, or we have to curtail production from those facilities. And so how that decision is arrived at, it's definitely, it requires a lot of consultation with, I think, everybody who's going to be impacted by those decisions, and decisions to proceed are then made with full information. And I'll just add to something that Ursula said earlier, I totally agree that the hydrogen thing is something which is going to be a very important decision for us as a secondary market for renewable energy. Germany and UK are absolutely for it, Japan is, and I note that South Korea are also big on hydrogen, but they just want to use steam methane reforming. They're not really interested in renewables. So these countries are all going for a hydrogen international market that's not there, and I think that represents a big opportunity.
All right, thank you. And we are running out of time, but Ursula, I'll just finish with one last question to you, and that's on decarbonisation. So discussions around decarbonisation tend to have a really strong focus on the energy industry. Do you think that this sector is, or why do you think the sector is so strongly targeted? And do you think the laser focus almost on the energy industry has meant that other industries have been overlooked in this sense?
Yes, well, it is a sector, the power sector is of course the sector where we are already seeing a very fast transformation. So we are seeing a transformation towards renewable energy. It's not fast enough, as I explained, for our targets, but it's already happening. So I guess that's always good. That is a sector where we can see, we have all the technologies there to decarbonize the power sector. And there is a transformation already ongoing because the market is already helping with the costs for renewable energy being cheaper than for fossil fuel alternatives. However, of course, we need to achieve the Paris Agreement, the climate change targets, and also other sustainability targets. We have to reduce all emissions across all sectors. And that's in particular important for Western Australia, which has also very energy intensive industry sectors. So the mining sectors and also the energy production, especially the LNG sector with growing emissions. So it's very important to address all of these sectors and to decarbonize the whole economy. However, the power sector, it is good to have a laser focus on the power sector because we can decarbonize it faster and because it can help decarbonize the other sectors. So electrification directly, as I said, electric cars, electric mobility or electric heating, but then also indirectly through fuels produced, for example, from hydrogen. So that is an important opportunity, but we have to look into the challenges and into the specific situation in every sector, and that's why it's important to have an across-the-economy approach and set targets that are more ambitious for the power sector and then help other sectors also to catch up and provide incentives for those investments in those sectors as well.
Thank you. Now I think we've probably run out of time. Do we have time for questions from the floor? 2 questions. Does anyone have any questions for the panellists? If you could just stand up and say your name and where you're from, that would be great. We have 2 people up the back here.
Paul Wilkes. I teach at Curtin Uni and also just retired from CSIRO. My question to you is about the so-called gas lead recovery. And it seems to me we're on a real collision course between a green lead recovery and a gas recovery. It's not surprising the COVID Commission is stacked full of gas people. So what do they produce? they produce lots of gas recommendations. And it seems to me we're on a perfect collision course. I would like to comment on this and how we can actually see more of the green-led recovery actually come to the fore.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's a very important aspect, and that links to the very beginning, how you introduced the question in terms of how are countries dealing with the COVID recovery and what kind of investments are needed. So what we need is this transition to renewable energy, and we need a shift in investments away from fossil fuels to clean energy, and that is then renewable energy. And we need that at a time pace that is consistent with reducing the emissions fast enough so that we achieve those temperature goals. And that means it's dangerous to start investing or to keep investing into new fossil fuel infrastructure, including gas. Because even though gas is named as a transition fuel, it has been named like that decades ago, and it does play a role as such, but we see from scenarios that are consistent with the Paris Agreement that also the use of gas has to be phased down, and it would then be an investment and a risk of creating new stranded assets if an investment into new gas is started. For example, we know that we don't need new gas for a transition of the power sector in Australia, and also not in Western Australia. So that is a big risk, and it's important and there are the opportunities to have a real green-led and renewable-led COVID recovery.
Hello, my name's Amanda, and I'm a member of the community and a long-term member of Sustainable Energy Now. And another question for you, Ursula. When we're talking about renewable energy planning zones and looking at exporting out to Southeast Asia and the Asian grid, what can be done to allow the vast amount of energy from WA to be exported when it's going to go by pipeline? Obviously there's a hydrogen solution, but if it was to go by any other means, it would need a pipeline, and there's that massive risk of redundancy of a fault with that single line. So is hydrogen the only solution, or can Western Australia or Australia connect to the Asian grid in other ways?
Yes, well, both solutions have been followed, and actually we have projects developing for both solutions. So for a grid connection, there's a project being developed from the Northern Territories, the Sun Cable, which would connect to Singapore. And the project that I mentioned earlier that has been developed for the Pilbara, that is now focusing on producing hydrogen, which can then be shipped, for example, also by producing ammonia, which has more hydrogen density, so it's easier to transport, and one can use also some of the existing infrastructure for shipping this. So both, and this Pilbara project actually was originally developed also with the idea of connecting with a grid connection. So I think both options exist, and there are projects being developed for both, and I think it's good that we are seeing several options and not just focus on one of them. And there's of course more flexibility if you look into shipping, for example, ammonia to in the end transport hydrogen and making it available in different paths depending on the developments in those markets as well.
I just wanted to thank Gary, Ursula and Anya for their time this evening and for the very insightful discussion.